It's a wonderful honor to welcome Meg Kissinger on this podcast. She is a visiting professor at Columbia University's School of Journalism, and she is an author of a wonderful memoir, While You Were Out, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence. So we're in for a wonderful conversation here. Meg, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you so much. I am very well. I'm glad to be here with you today.
Let's see. So before we begin, those who are watching on video, would you mind adjusting your camera because the sun is
Sure. I,
blaring.
yeah,
It's
there
either
we
the
go.
sun or the lights.
Yes, yes, sorry about that. Apologies.
It's okay.
It's
I
yeah,
think
good.
we should be good now.
Good.
So my first question would be, what would be some of the most difficult challenges you had to overcome while writing this memoir?
Yeah, well, first of all, it was the decision to write the memoir itself. So that was not a light one because the topic is very sensitive. I knew I'd be plowing over some very difficult material. The story of my family is one of great joy and great love, but also lots of sorrow. So I knew that in order to tell our story, I would be going to back into some very sad, dark moments. So just for your listeners' sake, the book is about growing up in a time, just as the title suggests, it's about growing up in the 1960s and 70s in a time when we didn't really discuss mental illness, and there was a lot of mental illness in my family. So I knew as a journalist, this is an area that I covered for many years as a reporter. My interest in it was logical, coming as I did from a family where there was so much mental illness. But I knew from my journalism that this was a topic that really affects almost everybody, but that we deal with it in many different ways. And so I just thought that our family could shed some light and be of help to other families. So that was the first challenge was, do I really want to go there? And then once I did that, I had the worry that I didn't want to really re-injure or re-traumatize my brothers and sisters. So I went to each of them and asked them what they thought of it. And once they gave me the green light and we're all on board, off I went.
Wonderful. So I wonder if the family members whom you've profiled in the book, have they received a copy? Have they read it? What did they think of it?
Oh, yes. So, um, again, just a little context. So two of my siblings, there were eight kids in the family. I was the fourth. I was, right in the middle. And so, two died by suicide. So, so I have, these five remaining siblings, and I went to them and said, you know, what do you think about writing about having this book being written? And as I said, once they agreed to it, this was the deal that I made with them. I said, I'm going to collect everything that I get. So I'm going to go back and get the police records of the days that Nancy and Danny, my brother and sister, died. I'm going to look through the medical files. I'm going to collect as much data or information as I can about our family background, our diagnoses, and any other pertinent information. You can read it if you want. You don't have to, but I am going to ask you to read the book before I submit it to the editor because I want to make sure that if there's anything in there that's going to be so damaging to you or that you can't live with, I want to know about that. Anyway, so I that was my one requirement. I said, please read this book before I submit it. And they all did. And they all again said, yep, that's fine. Let's go. So yeah, they've all read it. They've all been very generous and very supportive of it and encouraging other people to read it. And I have one brother who is a writes for a television news station in Chicago, and he was so excited or proud of the book that he invited me on to that news show, and then took me around the newsroom and introduced me to all of his coworkers, and it was really, really great.
I'm glad to hear it. So, you are an investigative reporter. So
Right.
I do have to ask whether there are any overlaps between investigative reporting and memoir writing. I would assume that the process of memoir writing is somewhat similar in that, but the subject is intensely personal, I suppose.
Sure. So I think the best stories are ones grounded in as many precise facts as possible. So, um, with a lot of journalism, we don't include ourselves in the story, but of course, a memoir, by its own definition, is a story about your life. It's about what you learned because of something that you went through. So what I learned was that mental illness, the secrecy around mental illness can be quite toxic. So we have to learn ways to talk about that. Sorry about that sunlight. I'm gonna keep moving this way. Um, oops, can you hold on 1 second and I'm gonna close that blind? Apologies for that. So the book again deals with this big wide sweep of history. So I'm looking at everything from my grandparents' era in the 1920s all the way up to modern day. So I knew that I would need to be accessing records and just the family history. So to write that just from memory would be very vague and I think very kind of wooden or shallow. What I was really looking for is to write as crisply and as vividly as possible and to put those precise details in there so that you're bringing the reader into that era and into so for example, I write about my father's was killed in World War II. And so I write about the date, how he died, and I got those records from the Army. So rather than just writing from family stories and the legend or however it was related to me, would have read pretty shallow. But I was able to get very crisp eyewitness accounts and very precise details, and that made it for much more vivid reading.
I see. So tell me about the title of the book.
Right. So the title is taken from an old back in the day, before cell phones and text messages, it was very common for people to get their phone messages on a little piece of pink paper. There were standardized notepads that read while you were out, and then it told you who called. And so this was a kind of a funny little story about when I was in college and my grandmother died, which is not funny, except that my mother left that message for me with the receptionist at the college where I was studying. And that pretty grim message was left for me on one of those little pieces of paper, just simply with 2 words that just said, Grandma died. While you were out, Grandma died. And I thought, well, really, that's kind of a metaphor for how our family dealt with talking about dark, heavy topics, is that we did it in a short way, in a kind of joking way. And it seemed to me that that was an apt way to describe the way our family communicated, which wasn't always the best way.
Um, so in writing this book, um, what do you hope to contribute to the ongoing discussion regarding mental illness and mental health treatment in America?
This is a great question, and I thank you for that. It's my intention is to bear witness, very simply put. Um, we are certainly not the only family that goes through this. In fact, one of my favorite quotes is from a man by the name of Thomas Insel, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for many years in America. And he said, there's two kinds of families, those with mental illness and those who will have mental illness. And So I've read a lot and heard a lot about what it's like to live with mental illness, but there's not a lot out there about the perspective about what the families go through. So I wanted to really take readers by the hand and show them in the most intimate way that this is what it looks like. This is how it feels. This is what you experience when your sister's so sick, or your brother's so sick, or your mother or your father. And these are the challenges. And you love them, you care for them, but they're very sick. And I wanted people to feel that. And so that's how I framed this book.
I see. So what are some of the challenges when discussing mental health and mental well-being currently?
One of the biggest challenges for me was remembering some of those very intense moments. So my sister died many years ago, and in the ensuing years, I really pushed her out of my thoughts. It was very painful to remember her because she lived such a tormented life, and it was easier to just kind of, at the time, to just move on. And so I didn't really process her grief fully. So that was a challenge to kind of reconstruct her life and to try and really recall her and reanimate her. My brother Danny, who died in 1997, so also not that recently, but I had more vivid memories of him. But the challenge was to recall them, to look for people who remembered them, to try and find the documentation of what their illnesses were. So really to get over that fog of not remembering so well. And then, another challenge is, what do you include in the book? What you don't want to overwhelm your readers. So I took this class on how to write a memoir. It's a woman by the name of Marion Roach Smith, who has a class that she offers called the Memoir Project. And she has this very useful advice for her students. And that is to imagine the explorer Galileo uh, beaming down into modern life. And he's going into a Walmart store, so a very big department store that has shelves and shelves of so many, everything from ski jackets to bottled water to pet supplies, just head spinning, all the offerings on the shelf. And what she recommends is, you know, don't overwhelm your reader by presenting everything on those shelves. Pretend like you're Galileo going into Walmart seeking just a few items. And so be very judicious about what you include. And it really has to all serve the purpose of what your book is. So in my case, the purpose of my book was to show that the secrecy around mental illness is toxic and can be very damaging. So all the stories that I recalled uh, needed to serve that theme. And some of them were crushingly sad. Some of them were very funny and delightful and heartwarming. So that was how I approached that.
So as an aside, since we are imagining Galileo in the 21st century going to a Walmart, what do you suppose would be amongst the items that he would pick up?
Galileo?
Yeah.
Well, I think he'd get an Apple Watch. I think he'd be fascinated by that. I don't know enough about Galileo to really imagine, except that I obviously he had a lot of curiosity and he was interested in how the world worked. So what do we need to know about how the world works in modern times? I think an Apple Watch would go pretty far. He might want to get some granola bars too, because that keeps you well fueled, and maybe some of that bottled water to hydrate.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I read these like picture books about like the great men and women who lived in the past. I think
Mhm.
I came across like one about Galileo, and I would assume that he would be rather intrigued by the fact that 600 years later, people would write about him and learn about him.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
So, tell me about a fond memory that you've included in the book regarding your childhood.
This one is pretty bittersweet, but it was the year after my sister died. And I had just graduated from college and I was at my first job as a newspaper reporter in upstate New York, a little town called Watertown. And I was really in over my head. I was confused. I think I was still grieving my sister. Wasn't sure if I was doing a very good job as a new reporter, and I was really out of sorts. And my dad came to visit me. He claimed he was just passing through town. He used to do a lot of business in New York City, and he lived in Chicago. So he said he was just stopping through town on his way home. Of course, it really wasn't on the way. So I suspected he was really coming to check up on me and to see if I was okay. Anyway, we went cross country skiing, which neither one of us knew how to do. We were okay on downhill skiing, but cross country skiing is a much different mechanism. And anyway, we were just kind of stumbling through the woods in northern New York. And it was so funny because we were so bad at it, but it was also very tender and sweet that my dad, was going out his way to spend time with me. And I remember as I was crashing through the woods, and he used to call me Muggs. That was his nickname for me. And he said, "Keep chugging, Muggs." And I think about that so much now. He was meaning keep chugging to stay, vertical while I'm skiing. But I like to think of it too in a broader context that he's encouraging me to keep going when I get discouraged and to just keep moving along.
So, your upbringing in a Catholic household is featured prominently in the beginning of the book.
Yes.
And not to assume your age, since we are only meeting for the first time, I would assume
I
that you were there when John F. Kennedy was elected. And I wonder
Yeah.
how did that impacted the family and yourself too?
Sure. Well, I was very small when I'm 66 years old, so I was born in 1957. Kennedy was elected in 1960, so I was 3. I have no memory of that, but I have a very vivid memory of the day he was assassinated. I was in first grade, and it was a terrible shock. And we were all called into we were all called together to kneel down and pray a rosary, and then we were sent home. Um, and so how it affected us, we were my grandmother, who was a character, she was of Irish descent, and she was very proud of the fact that Kennedy, and she was a very devout Catholic. Um, and so she was very excited that there was an Irish Catholic man as president of the United States. So his assassination was a great blow to her. And we were all very sad about it.
Mhm. And I wonder if you still keep the faith at present.
I do, and it's a complicated matter. So this is how I explain it. Um, I I believe that faith is really a gift, that this is something that you either have or you don't. If you have it, I think you're well served by working on it as a muscle, the way you would work out if you had a bum knee or a bad back. I think you need to that it's good to work on your faith. And I do that by prayer, meditation, acts of kindness. Um, so that's one thing, faith. And then there's organized religion. So however you construct that, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever your expression of that faith is. And I think that those constructs are always going to be flawed because they're run by human beings, and every human being is flawed. And so there's problems with the Catholic Church that bother me terribly. So, everybody knows what they are. Everything from the sex abuse scandal to the bigotry against women, as the not allowing women priests. Anyway, a big laundry list of places where I feel the Catholic Church falls short of what I believe to be the message of Christ, of God made flesh. Um, that said, my faith is very important to me, and I work hard to maintain that. Um, I go into in the book, I detail how the Catholic Church really failed our family in many ways. That my father was so worried about whether my sister would be allowed to be buried in the Catholic cemetery and whether or not they would be able to have a funeral mass ritual for her. Um, that's why he told us all to say that it was an accident. And so that was, for my way of thinking, that was the Catholic Church really falling short in ministering to us and being there for us as a comfort. But I also need to say that over the years, the Catholic Church has provided great comfort to us. They've done other acts of kindness, and there's a support group attached to the Archdiocese in Chicago that's been very helpful to my family. So, most things in life have two sides, at least two sides to that story, and I would include the Catholic Church in that.
Um, this year marks my first year as a Catholic convert, and I understand that. I think this affects every Catholic. I think it's that every Catholic has a complex relationship with his or her faith. Of course, that goes into every other faith denominations too, but I think I felt that the most profoundly amongst the believers of Catholicism.
Do you mind if I ask you what it was that drew you to convert to Catholicism?
Um, I would say a mixture of mm, adverse personal circumstances and exposures to, the Catholic Church as it is meant to be understood, rather than what the negative feedback or media has been saying about it.
So you found comfort and help in the Catholic Church. Is that right?
Yes, and since we are on the topic, I was going through some several like mental health issues,
Mhm.
and um, yeah, and I've already known stuff about the church
Mhm.
then, but what I was attracted to is the Catholic faith and
Right.
the idea that this systematized theology that's based on, well, the teachings of one God man, Jesus Christ. Very comforting.
It is very comforting. I came up with this line the other day. I don't even know where it came from, but somebody was asking me about my relationship with my faith, which is very important to me. And I just blurted this out, but I think it's a pretty good line, so I'm going to use it again. And it's, I'm humbled by the message of Christ. And when I look up and see, a church or wherever, you see Christ hanging on the cross, and you think, well, I didn't have a very bad day by comparison. So I think what for me, what my faith does is it gives me proportion. It helps me to see that, yeah, I might be suffering now, but there's a lot of suffering in the world, and a lot of and Christ certainly did suffer. And so that's a kind of a he's a great role model for how to manage your suffering. And I get a lot of comfort out of that and a lot of inspiration.
Yes, I can say the same.
Great.
Um, since you mentioned the topic, of course, Catholic doctrine is very harsh towards people who take their own lives.
Right.
And I wonder, how did you personally reconcile yourself with that, having seen, your close family uh,
Right.
in it
Yeah.
that way?
That too is very nuanced. Well, so when you boil it all down, the doctrine of the Catholic Church remains that suicide is a mortal sin. And there's a little wiggle room now allowed in that there's a little more leeway, a little more freedom on how to interpret that, because there's an acknowledgement now among the Catholic Church leaders that people who are not in their right mind, so they're despairing, their thoughts are so clouded by their illness that they're really not acting rationally, so they can't be held to that standard. So when I think about my sister both my sister and my brother, both of them were so ill, at the time of their deaths, that I don't think any logical person would argue that they made a rational decision. Of course, we don't know that, we don't know what was in their heart or what was in their mind. So I don't have a clean answer to that. I just feel in my heart that they were suffering and they were so desperate to end their suffering that that was the recourse that they chose. I'm not going to judge them for that. I don't think the God that I love and worship, I don't believe that God would either.
Do you believe that people can find comfort and some sort of a balm, so to speak, to alleviate their mental illnesses via religious faith, Catholicism or otherwise?
Sure, I have. Um, I think when we talk about mental illness, it's such a huge term. It's such a big tent. You can have everything from situational depression, somebody in your family's just died, or you were fired from your job, or you were just diagnosed with cancer, whatever circumstances happen in life, and you're anxious or despairing or depressed. That's mental illness. But then there are other forms, what the diagnostic manual for doctors to code their illnesses. There's a designation of serious mental illness, which is really about 6% of all forms of mental illness, which is schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression. And those are lifetime battles. Those are struggles that with medication and therapy, you can probably manage okay, but you're never gonna fully recover. So I think the practice of religion can serve again as a way to give proportion to the suffering or the struggling that you're having. It gives you empathy and brings you into communion with other people who are also suffering. And there's a great comfort that can come from communal prayer or acts, good acts that certain faith traditions, organizing community events or acts of charity. So participating in that. I was just saying to a family member yesterday who's struggling a little bit, and I said, whenever I feel kind of down, what makes me feel better is doing something kind for somebody else, reaching out and just sending a note to somebody, or going and making a meal for somebody, or raking their lawn, or doing something that's going to be helpful for them, going outside of myself and being in service to somebody else. And that has proven to be a big help from me and my feeling better about myself. And I think that's what organized religion can facilitate that.
And in regards to the discussion about mental health, I suppose aside from the scientific literature, like mm, accounts written by psychiatrists and psychologists and such, how essential do you believe that personal stories like yours can help with it?
I believe that telling your story is a kind of prayer, and it's a way to be in communion with other people. That said, it's you have to pick the right way to say it and the right time and the right place. So, but it's very human instinct to want to tell your story, to want to be heard. And I think it's also, we need to be generous to one another and find ways to listen to others when they want to tell their story. So I do believe that storytelling is a very important part of the human experience. Writing this book has been a great gift for me to be able to take a very chaotic family life and give it some kind of form, some kind of arc and structure. And that's been very freeing, when anytime you can kind of put something together and form a picture makes it clearer, that gives you some peace, and that's a good thing. And so I'm very grateful for that gift. And um, but that said, it can't just be, when you write a book, you can't be so selfish as to think that it's just going to be for you. In fact, really, you really need to be thinking about your reader. Another great lesson from that class that I took was that the Marion Roach Smith said, remember, this memoir is not about you. It's for your readers, and it's about what your readers can learn from you. So I was very mindful of that when I wrote this. It wasn't just meant to be cathartic for me. It was meant to be informative or enlightening for my readers.
Tell me about a difficult episode in the book wherein you had to bear witness to the mental illnesses in your family.
As I was writing the book,
Um, I guess an episode that was included in the book.
oh, included in the book, yeah. Well, the most difficult one for me to write was my own kind of breakdown when I was 17 years old and my sister Nancy was very sick. She had moved away for a while. That my parents had she had gone to a facility, a very expensive, a very highly regarded psychiatric hospital in Topeka, Kansas, and it was, considered one of the premier places, very expensive. And my mom and dad spent a lot of most of their savings on that, and it was not successful. It was a failure. And Nancy came home, and I was a senior in high school, and I was rejected from the college that I really wanted to go to. I was just having a terrible time, and I lost it. I just started throwing things, and my mother had asked me a question that I didn't respond well to, and she ended up calling the police on me. And that's a very painful memory for me. I lost control, and my mother did the only thing that she thought would help the situation. It was the only thing that made sense to her, was to call the police. So it's embarrassing, to think of now. It's disturbing. But I thought it was very important to include in the book because I wanted to show that this was what was happening all throughout my family, was our inability to control our emotions and our inability to express ourselves really thoughtfully or effectively, and how we responded to that.
What do you believe was the most important factor keeping the family together during difficult times like these?
We're so lucky in our family that we all have a great sense of humor. That both my mom and dad were really funny people, and we get a kick out of each other. We try to make each other laugh all the time, which is really a form of love. If you think about it, it's really a way to care for one another and to lighten the burden. Um, and so that has helped us tremendously, is our good humor. My mom and dad were also very generous. Our house was a place where everybody came. So everybody's friends, we would all kind of meet at our house. We never locked the door. Few people ever rang the doorbell. They just walked in the house. It was just a very welcoming, friendly place. So we had lots and lots of friends. Our nobody was too eccentric or um, too off-putting to be kept from our house. We were very welcoming people. Excuse me. So that helped us a lot. Um, yeah, and I think that those were the qualities that that we grew up with. Empathy and humor have really served us well, and we're we still do that for one another all the time.
Is humor a key to empathy?
I think it opens some doors. Now humor can also be off-putting, I've discovered.
Mhm.
Uh, we have used humor also in our family in sarcastic ways to kind of keep us from dwelling on some sadness or some painful memories. Humor is a way to kind of deflect that. Um, So I think you have to be careful about how you express your humor, and not have it be from a place of anger, but from a place of empathy. So I think humor can invite empathy and be as I said, and like an invitation to a relationship.
Mhm. Yes, I think speaking from personal experience, I do find it helpful to have a sense of humor to
Mhm.
to help you cope with the difficult times. And to me, at least, you can always tell if someone has, I guess, experienced more than his or her fair share of suffering, and those who have been mercifully spared from that based on their sense of humor, because those who have gone through a lot, their sense of humor can be quite off-putting, as you've alluded to.
Yeah, I think some of the funniest comedians, I mean, usually their acts are all about their failures. And the funniest people I know are also the most humble.
Mhm.
And they're willing to make themselves the butt of the joke, or bring themselves back down to earth and reveal kind of the stupid things they've done or the silly situations they've gotten themselves into. And they do that by bringing themselves low. And isn't that what we look to Christ, his example of humility, and God made flesh, brought down to earth, being in communion with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes.
Mhm.
It's we're all about uh being together again in communion. And that's what humor can do, that when it's done well, that's what humor can do best, I think.
Mhm. Yes, I'm of course reminded of Thomas More, the prayer for good humor.
Yeah,
Give me a good stomach and something good to eat. I think that's how it begins.
that's great. I got to look that up. That's wonderful.
Yes, I know that there are more of it, but those are the two first lines I can remember.
That's great.
Now, since we mentioned John F. Kennedy, of course, before he was assassinated, he signed into law an important piece of legislation when it comes to um, treating those with mental illnesses. So, how would you judge the impact of that piece of legislation now?
Well, it was such a great idea. So what this was the Mental Health Act of 1963, which was the last piece of legislation that Kennedy signed. He signed it on October 31st of 1963, and it would be 3 weeks later that he would be assassinated. But what it was meant to do was to transfer the responsibility for caring for people with mental illness from the states, the individual states in America, to the federal government.
Mhm.
And they would have oversight. And it divided the nation. The plan was to divide the nation into these catchment areas, which were like congressional districts anyway, and each catchment area would have its own offerings of mental health care. Beautiful plan, but then not fully executed. After Kennedy was killed, really the focus fell away, and people did not follow through. And more than half of those catchment areas, more than half of those mental health centers that were promised were never built. And then various other administrations tried to resurrect that or come up with their own good plan, in particular Jimmy Carter. And then he was defeated, and along came Ronald Reagan. And Reagan's first act was to set aside all the progress that the Carter administration had made. So there was not the uniform federal political will. And that is the problem when we are too ashamed to talk about our mental illness. We don't have the clout, we don't have the political pull to demand better care. So you see other people suffering from other forms of illness who are more successful at getting federal funds or public policy to address their illnesses in ways that are denied to people with mental illness.
How do you suppose those being afflicted with mental illnesses can better advocate for themselves?
By speaking up, by revealing, nobody wants to hear everybody just bellyache about their whatever is, whatever is troubling them all the time. But I think to insist on equal care, to look at this, I look at this now rather than looking at this, what we always refer to as stigma, which is what it really is shame. And I think when you frame it like that, we're ashamed to discuss our illness. And then therefore, people are discriminate against us. So when we frame it like that, that people with mental illness are discriminated against in ways that you wouldn't for heart patients or cancer patients, people struggling with other forms of illness. I believe that is more effective or more impactful in getting parity and getting true equal justice and equal service. So what we can do for individuals can do, insist on equal care and equal coverage, equal insurance coverage, equal access to care. We need many more practitioners. It has to be more affordable. And don't be afraid to demand better care for yourself or somebody who you love who has mental illness.
So how do you keep I guess, the considerations of the humanity of those afflicted in mind, while also keeping in mind that for many with like severe mental health problems, they can pose a danger to themselves as well as to others.
Right. Yeah, that's very tricky. And it's true too. I mean, we need to acknowledge that people with severe mental illness untreated can indeed be a danger to themselves and others. And they may reject the care that we're offering them or even insisting. And then you've got a real sticky situation on your hand. You really need to compel them into care. And is that the right thing to do? Well, if you're a member of society, we have a duty to keep each other safe. And so there are instances when people need to be kept against their will and confined to a area where they're not going to hurt each other. That's very difficult. That you're denying their freedom to do what they want. And that's a uncomfortable place to be, but it needs to be done sometimes.
Now, of course, you and I both live through the year 2020, where there's a wave of, I guess, criticisms and calling for police reforms because of George Floyd. I think one of the talking points that I think was unfortunately lost in a sea of talking points is the idea that police maybe, and I would say almost certainly, are incapable of dealing with clinical situations regarding someone who has mental illnesses and, well, they had a psychotic break, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Um, I wonder what can be a better, I guess, solution or remedy rather than dialing 911 when confronting
Right.
someone with
Right.
that problem.
Yeah, this is a huge problem, and one that is being addressed in various ways, some more effective than others. But there is an acknowledgement. First of all, a lot of police officers hate to be answering these phone calls, from frantic family members to get, to detain somebody out of control. Um, they didn't become a police officer to be a psychiatrist. But really, the fact of the matter is, a great majority of phone calls that the police get are from that are cases are cases of people acting out in psychotic ways. So they need training. Police officers need to be trained in mental health and how to de-escalate a tense, fraught, emotional situation. Um, but you want to get to people before it devolves into that situation. So there are a lot of these pilot programs now where they're pairing a psychologist with a police officer. In some cases, they send social workers and psychologists and not a police officer. So it's not always necessary. I think we overemphasize how dangerous people are just by virtue of having mental illness. Most people are not dangerous. Some are, but a majority are not. So getting to people, offering them learning ways to listen to them and hearing them and responding to them, not in confrontational ways, but in earnest, generous ways.
One of the previous guests on this program is a wonderful man, Andrew Skoll. He wrote a book called Desperate Remedies.
I
That's
know, and yeah,
about how the field of clinical psychiatry has failed to treat mental illnesses.
mhm.
So I wonder, um, how would you make the case that, well, despite all of that, the the scientific practice of curing mental illnesses can still be trusted?
How would could you rephrase
Right.
or
So how can we trust the I guess the say the pharmaceutical industry or the doctors, the men in the white lab coats? How can we trust their opinion when we know that this is the history?
right? Um, the answer to everything is not medication. Um, we become so medicalized and over medicated. Wow, it's staggering to me how many medications a lot of patients are. And the fact of the matter is, almost none of these medications are really very helpful, and none of them are curative. Um, I mean, they can help people get over humps. It varies by, of course, circumstance. But we can't just rely on medic the medical profession. We all have to learn how to um, deal with people in our lives, family and friends and ourselves, and find the language to talk about what's bothering us and be better at listening and be better at sharing our own thoughts and feelings. Um, we can't just, again, like farm this out to the medical profession. It's just not sustainable. There's not enough practitioners.
Mhm. Yes. I would say that the another like great issue when discussing and treating mental illnesses and also maintaining mental well-being is that for many people we've relegated that to the professionals, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, and we don't assume like a partial responsibility in helping the quest for mental wellness, so to speak.
Right. Right. Yeah. I've talked about my older brother a lot, but it's with good reason because he's a fantastic example. So my older brother lives in a group home for people with serious mental illness. Jake, my brother's name is Jake, and he has depression, but he also has kind of a thinking disorder. He's very bright, he's very intellectual, but he is not really well able to organize his thoughts sometimes. And so he really has a hard time living on his own. So he prefers living in a group setting. Anyway, Jake is very forthcoming about when things are tough for him, and he will reach out to those of us in the family and say, I'm struggling today, or I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling lonely. Sometimes he says, I'm feeling suicidal. And we surround him with love and ways to for him to talk about it, and what can we do to help. So to me, that takes great courage, what Jake is doing. It takes humility and it takes great courage. And we rise to that occasion. If we could all be a little bit more like my brother Jake, I think our lives would be a lot richer and happier.
I see. Um, I'm somehow reminded of how Hollywood movies portray mental illnesses. There are plenty of issues when thinking of movies like Rain Man or was it I Am Sam or whatever. But I think the biggest one of all, at least in my view, is that characters who possess these like um, you know these issues, they always either have to be compensated by either a genius level intellect like Dustin Hoffman or a really, really kind heart like
Right.
Sean Penn in I Am Sam.
Yeah.
But I wonder, it can there be like a someone who has like serious mental health problems but are, I guess, normal, so to speak, or it's like average in any other way, just so that we can, as humans, can relate to them better, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm groping for examples. I mean, I thought Silver Linings Playbook
Yeah.
with Bradley Cooper, that did a
Mhm.
pretty good job, showed um it shows some complexity. Uh my I've come to know so many people with serious mental illness over the years, again, both as a family member and as a journalist. And I that's what I love most about writing about these people, or I mean, yeah, or just being with them. Is their complexity. The people that I know are some of the funniest, most generous. I've said that in the book, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way. I just mean you're right. We want to assign these either angel, devil, whatever, these very kind of tidy narratives. And they're human beings, so they're complicated. And so therefore they have a myriad of emotions and characteristics.
Yes, I love Silver Linings Playbook too. I watch it with my parents, and it is a good portrayal of both like living as someone with a mental illness and
Mhm.
also living with someone who has a mental
Yes,
illness.
right, right.
Um, so of course, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s his most famous words are judge someone not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But when it comes to people with mental illnesses, that line can be
Mm.
ambiguous. Like, how is someone's mental illness a part of the content of their character? How would you assess that?
Wow. That is really something to think about. Um, and what is the mental illness? You know, how are the actions caused by the mental illness, or is there a causation? I have no idea the answer to that, except that, um, yeah, I I I I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I think um, we just we need to regard people with mental illness the way we regard all people. That's always been my framework in the stories that I wrote for the newspaper over the years, and in the telling of this book, is they're human beings. So it's, yeah, I think, I don't know how much it would depend, did the mental illness cause the person to act the way they did? Um, Yeah, and I don't know how we know that.
Yes,
Something to think about, yeah.
yes. So, a concluding question. When it comes to, I guess, providing better treatment, either medical or social,
Mhm.
what do you believe we can do less of and more of in order to make that happen?
Well, more of is more access. So anybody who needs to see a professional would have access to that. That's not the case currently. It's way too expensive. There are too few practitioners, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so we need to make that more available. Um, and what we need less of is judgment. So it's not your fault if you have depression, if you have anxiety, you don't want to have that. It's not because you're lazy or not because you are a poor moral character. And it's probably not anything your parents did or your family did to you. It's 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 probably just in your makeup, and it's part of who you are. So we need to stop judging people who have mental illness as though it were their fault, and just look at them about what it is that they need. Somebody asked me one time, such a great question, how do I think my brother and sister, how do I think their lives would have been different if instead of saying, "What's the matter with you?" somebody said, "What do you need?" Or "What happened to you?" And so listening to their stories, sitting with them, and treating them as a human being, and not as a problem to solve, but as a person to love. That sounds very flabby, but I really think it's profound. And I think if we make what we need to do more of is to meet people where they are and just be with them, be a partner with them, and sit by their side, hold their hand, listen to them, help them feel better and more connected.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Meg Kissinger, for joining the show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.